This is The Big Picture on POTUS.
All right, welcome back to The Big Picture. I'm Olivier Knox. As always, you can find me on Twitter at OKNOX. My first guest is joining me now, Dr. Alex Del Carmen, Associate Dean and Professor at the Tarleton State University School of Criminology, Criminal Justice, and Strategic Studies in Fort Worth, Texas. You can find the professor on Twitter at DC Consulting TX. Professor, welcome.
Thank you.
The piece that caught my eye, the phenomenon that caught my eye was police compiling profiles on speakers at board meetings. What is going on?
So essentially what we have learned is that the Chicago Police Department, there were a few officers that essentially would do background checks ahead of the speaking engagements that citizens had before these review boards. They would simply look them up to see if they had any arrest and, what their criminal background was before the individual showed up to these meetings.
So what kind of boards were we talking about here? What were these citizens trying to do?
So essentially, these are the Chicago Police Board meetings, and at this particular meetings, this is where citizens essentially show up and, talk to individuals that relate to the discipline of police officers, right? So these meetings are of the city's police, what they call police disciplinary panels, all right? And at these meetings, individuals that may have a complaint about a police officer or information about the wrongdoing of an officer, citizens would be afforded the opportunity of showing up at these meetings and simply disclosing that information before a board. And so the police officers that were present, at these meetings were essentially, getting the list of speakers ahead of schedule, and they would do background checks on them, before the individual showed up to the meetings.
What were the police doing with these background checks?
So they alleged that nothing was done as a result of the background checks, but of course, the whole question is at this point, why would they need to do a background check on individuals? And the general premise of that across the United States is that, if you have any kind of threat, if you believe that somebody may pose a threat to the meeting or to the safety of those individuals at the meeting, then that background check will be warranted. But the absence of that is simply extraordinary and out of the norm for police departments across the United States.
Talking to Dr. Alex Del Carmen, Associate Dean and Professor at the Tarleton State University School of Criminology, Criminal Justice, and Strategic Studies in Fort Worth, Texas. When I first saw this, I thought, oh, is this a PR thing? In other words, are they preparing for what the speaker might disclose in that meeting? Is that why they're doing these background checks?
No, absolutely not, right? So there's nothing that a background check would disclose about the content of what the person is going to talk about, right? So the idea is that what we call an NCIC background on an individual would be whether or not the person was arrested, whether or not the person is a sex offender, whether the person is registered as a sex offender. So it would give that officer background information on whether or not the person is a fugitive. These are typically done when police officers stop an individual and run a driver's license, for instance, or when they have a justifiable, legal reason, we call it probable cause in our world, as to why they would need to run a background. But in places like Texas, where I reside, this would be extraordinary. It would be prohibited, and police officers are absolutely banned from doing this at will. You would have to have a legal reason as to why they would need to do this.
You anticipated my next question, which is this legal? Is it merely weird, or is it illegal?
So there are 2 points to that, right? The question is, does it violate policy? And the other question is it illegal, right? So I try to get clarification whether in the city of Chicago this was an illegal act, and from what I've gathered, I don't think it is. But what is, in fact, the case is that it is completely outside of the norm, and it is outside of any policy that the Chicago Police Department would have in place. Keep in mind, too, that the Chicago Police Department just recently entered into a voluntary police reform case that they actually is now in place, and so it'll be interesting to see what those federal monitors are going to do with this information and how they're going to ensure that this doesn't happen again.
All right, Professor Alex Del Carmen, Associate Dean. Actually, one more before I let you go, Professor. So what kind of remedies are there for the citizens whose backgrounds were investigated this way?
You know, that's going to be an interesting, question, right? Mostly for them, which is I'm sure that they have a civil recourse as to, whether or not they want to hire attorneys and file lawsuits against the city and certainly the police department. The other question is if they don't want to go that way, perhaps, file complaints against the officers that did it. But there is no question in my mind as a criminologist, with 21 years of experience working with law enforcement, that in fact these officers the investigation will need to be launched and explanations will need to be provided as to why it is that they did this, and if the wrong reasons are given or they're not justified under the law, discipline needs to take place for sure.
All right, Dr. Alex Del Carmen, Associate Dean and Professor at the Tarleton State University School of Criminology, Criminal Justice, and Strategic Studies in Fort Worth, Texas. Professor, thank you very, very much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.